Now, details of the phone call between President Trump and his Ukrainian counterpart appear to confirm that the US president asked for an investigation into his political rival, Joe Biden. Now, this memo outlines the details of this controversial call between US President Donald Trump and President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. And it was released just 24 hours after Democrats launched these impeachment proceedings against the president. And the pages include the US president asking for a favor from Volodymyr Zelensky, whether his attorney general could cooperate with Zelensky in launching an inquiry into Joe Biden's son's dealings in Ukraine. Now, let's remember now that Joe Biden is obviously the frontrunner, the Democrat frontrunner in that 2020 presidential election, who Donald Trump will be standing against. Well, for more analysis on this, let's hear now from Kelly O'Donnell, and she is NBC's White House correspondent.
Good evening from an eventful day at the White House, where officials here released 5 pages of highly unusual material. The president declassified notes from his July conversation with Ukraine's President Zelensky. And within that, it reveals his references to his political rival, Joe Biden, and asking Ukraine's president to investigate Biden's son, also talking about other investigations and some references to U.S. military aid to Ukraine. This comes at a time when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, who has long been reluctant to pursue impeachment of President Trump, has now embraced the idea of moving forward with that. That could ultimately be a rebuke of the president. We're a long way from the official stage where that moves in that direction, but it has turned a corner. It could ultimately end in removal of the president from office, although that still seems unlikely because of Republicans' control of the Senate. Still, perilous times for President Trump. Just 1 week after the whistleblower complaint became public, and all of these changes, the call for impeachment from the House Speaker, the White House releasing this classified document, the president saying he did nothing wrong, that this was a perfectly lovely congratulatory call for the newly elected Ukraine president. And at the same time, the president saying this is Democrats reaching for what he describes as a new witch hunt, trying to undermine his time in office. There was a lot to dig into this, and Democrats believe the president abused his power, tried to use his office to seek information about a potential political rival in former Vice President Joe Biden. And of course, this all came after the Mueller investigation, a couple of years of the president under scrutiny for Russia's interference in the U.S. election. And still, the president was talking about U.S. election issues with a foreign leader. So many questions still to be dealt with. The president on the defense as he is hosting international leaders at the United Nations General Assembly. I'm Kelly O'Donnell for Euronews at the White House.
OK, well, and there may well be a press conference between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky later on tonight. We'll, of course, be bringing you that live. And still to come on the programme, well, our international correspondent tells us about her conversation with a former ISIS fighter. Welcome back to Euronews Tonight. Well, scientists behind a landmark study have delivered a stark warning. Slash emissions or watch cities vanish under rising seas, rivers run dry and marine life collapse. Well, according to the new report by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, rising temperatures are putting massive pressure on marine ecosystems. Well, the IPCC projects that sea levels will rise by 1 metre by 2100 if emissions keep climbing. Well, heating oceans are also causing more intense tropical storms to batter coasts with stronger winds and greater amounts of rainfall. Well, for more on that stark warning from the UN, I'm joined now by Jean-Pierre Gattuso, the CNRS research professor at the Sorbonne University and IDRI. Thanks so much for joining us on the programme. It's getting pretty frightening, isn't it, as we hear these reports again and again. And now it does appear that we've reached the point of no return. Briefly outline for me your best but also worst case scenario.
Well, this report contrasts two scenarios, a scenario with low emissions of greenhouse gases that is compatible with the Paris Agreement, and one scenario which is using intensively fossil fuel with therefore high emission scenarios. And so the report contrasts this for sea level rise, for warming, all the impacts on ocean and the cryosphere, that is the iced areas in the world. And so, as you said, sea level rise is expected to rise by 1.1 meter if we don't sharply reduce CO2 emissions, with consequences for, of course, local communities everywhere, including in developed countries such as cities such as New York.
Well, in fact, yes, some 2 billion people live on coastlines. So this will have a huge knock-on effect. In terms of those knock-on effects, what concerns you the most?
So beside that, there are many impacts of warming, for example, on the ocean, which in fact will generate huge crisis of mortality. Like we hear about coral reefs, we hear about coral bleaching and the loss of coral reefs, which is absolutely dramatic for those local communities, because they provide food, they provide security from sea level rise. There are also this warming of the ocean causes a redistribution of marine species, with tropical species moving north in the northern hemisphere and south in the southern hemisphere. So therefore a decline in the biodiversity in the tropics, and some areas will benefit from that in the North Atlantic, for example, with more fish coming around. So huge impacts also on fisheries and food securities for local communities, which actually need this source of proteins from the ocean.
Okay, and these projections rarely, and very rarely underline, provide good news. And projections of the rise of sea levels this time around is actually much higher than was projected back in 2014, just 5 years ago. Why is that?
Why is that? It's because the melting of Greenland was underestimated in the previous IPCC report published in 2013. And in this report, this takes into consideration the fact that Greenland is melting much faster than it was projected a few years ago. And also in the future, the contribution of the Arctic ice, the melting of Arctic ice, will also contribute. And the two together make the future projections, much higher than they used to be.
Okay, well, stark warnings there. Well, thanks so much, Jean-Pierre Gattuso from the Sorbonne University. Now, as the so-called caliphate rose, thousands of Europeans flocked to join ISIS. But what remains of the group's European foot soldiers? Well, this week, Euronews is looking into the aftermath of ISIS in Syria and what drove thousands of young Europeans to the battlefield. Our international correspondent, Annelise Borges, joins me now in the studio. Well, Annelise, you've been in northern Syria. You managed to speak to one of these former foreign fighters, and he told you how he ended up being a fighter for ISIS. What did he tell you?
Absolutely. Well, Hamza Namei told me about what drove him, what motivated him to leave Belgium at the age of 23 to go fight a war that wasn't his. He spoke about a multitude of personal reasons, about the loss of a loved family member that really shook him and made him look for solace in religion. He also spoke about spending time with what he described as the wrong people, who eventually dragged him into a world of radical ideas and brutal acts.
Yes, I want a second chance, that Belgium give me a second chance, because I know that Belgium take part of women and children. There's a way. If there's a way for the women and children, why is not a way for men?
You're basically asking for mercy, but the group you were part of showed virtually no mercy. Do you understand how hard it can be for authorities and for the European public as well to forgive you, to not be afraid of you?
If I was in the place in the authority, or even I was from the population, I say the same thing. Let these people die. Let these people send them to Baghdad, make this and this. That's the opinion public. I understand this feeling, that the people are angry. I can understand this. But don't forget, we have feeling. You understand?
Well, Annalise, we have feelings too. It's kind of shocking to me as I hear that. But I suppose there are a lot of paths to radicalisation, aren't there? And would you say that Europe is prepared to take these fighters back?
Well, the issue of reintegrating these fighters, these former fighters, those who choose to actually disengage from that kind of violence, is a very daunting question, isn't it? Especially with regards to the sheer number of people. We're talking about 20 to 40,000 foreigners who joined ISIS from 110 different countries. And it's very difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all policy to this because, as you said, there are a multitude of reasons. They are all very different people with different stories, different causes, different experiences. Governments have been choosing to either prosecute them, incarcerate them, and that proves difficult because the evidence, the witnesses are all back in the battlefield, sometimes in Syria and Iraq. Others have been investing in rehabilitation programs, and that comes, of course, with a cost. And what I've heard throughout my time researching this project was, should we really be spending money on people that turn their backs on us? Well, authorities really must weigh the risks these former fighters pose versus the prospects of reintegrating and the costs of reintegrating them into society while running the risk of losing track of them forever because they are being held by a non-recognized government in a very volatile region.
Annalise, very briefly now, because I'm just wondering, how did you get access to a former foreign fighter?
Well, we asked Kurdish authorities, who currently hold some 2,000 of them, of foreigner fighters, to speak to one of them, to meet them. And we asked to meet an European national to try to understand what drove him to join this fight. And Hamza Nemei agreed to speak to us. He agreed to be filmed. And he said he wanted to do that because he's in a quest for forgiveness, a quest for a second chance.
Quest for a second chance. Well, Annalise Borges, thanks so much for talking to us. And still to come on the programme, well, Alex is in the queue.
Indeed, Isabel, will bring you the latest reaction to all those goings on in the House of Commons. That's in just a few moments' time.
Welcome back to the programme. Well, as you can imagine, all this latest Brexit drama is getting a lot of you talking online. Well, let's get all the latest reaction from Alex and the Cube team.
The scenes are pretty extraordinary, aren't they, Isabel? Televised, of course, around the world. The proceedings in the House of Commons becoming a drama. Everybody is watching, and there's a lot of people talking about that online. Let's bring you up just some of what people are saying. Elizabeth here, she's one of those who found the Prime Minister's tone very concerning, saying Johnson directly pitting the public against Parliament. She says another worrying step on the slippery slope that has been his leadership. That's one side. But flipping around on the other side, you've got people like Alan Sked here. He's an emeritus professor. Fair to say he's probably leaning towards supporting Boris in this, saying what a waste of everybody's time this has been to get Parliament back, only to hear, in his words, the whinging, the wailings of windbags like Ian Blackford of the Scottish National Party and those who want rid of Boris and Brexit. So there's two sides there. Let's bring you what the politicians themselves have been tweeting. We've got MPs like Rory Stewart of the Conservative Party ran against Boris Johnson in the election on a very combative, it's fair to say, position against Boris's no-deal Brexit plans or the possibility of entertaining it. Rory saying here it's not and will never be appropriate for a British Prime Minister to second-guess the decisions of the Supreme Court. Now, of course, Rory no longer a member of the party because of his opposition to Boris, but extraordinary when you think these two at the last election stood on the same manifesto, were elected for the same party. Now look at them. Well, you've also got people like the chairman of the Labour Party in the UK, again, picking up on the language that was used there. Ian Lavery here saying uncomfortable and uneasy. Some people accusing Boris of sounding like a dictator. Really extraordinary. But then you've got the other hand. Some people listening to the same thing, like Dan Hodges, and hearing not Boris Johnson acting as a dictator, but as the saviour of democracy. People standing up for democracy, saying, not sure it was his best, but the problem for Corbyn, as Boris Johnson's pointing out, that he should bring the challenge to the government and is failing to do it. Well, let me just end by showing you this. Look at this. This is the UK top trends just now. That's House of Commons, Boris Johnson's speech, Parliament, John Burkow, one hit wonder day. We'll probably ignore that one. But you can see at least in the top three dominating the conversation in the Times, Ian Blackford down the bottom there. This is dominating the conversation. And just the tweets I've shown you there, look how it's polarising not just individual users, but look at the tone that we're hearing out of politicians themselves. This truly is a really tense time in the UK. The proceedings in the chamber still ongoing. It'll be an extraordinary chapter to witness, Isabel.
Polarising times. Well, Alex and the Cube team, thanks so much for bringing us all that reaction. And we leave you with a no comment from a section of the Val Ferret Valley in Italy, near Mont Blanc, which is being threatened by a fast-moving melting glacier that could collapse, prompting the mayor to close the access road.